So we're now going to start talking about generics. So what are generics in Java and why would we want to actually use them? Now actually, as you'll see in a minute, we've already used generics so far in the course and they actually are incredibly useful. So just as we can create methods that take arguments in Java and we can replace the parameters that we declare for the method, generics allow us to create classes, interfaces and methods that take types as parameters called, unsurprisingly, type parameters. So different to other parameters, we're talking about type parameters. So you've seen in previous videos when we created array lists and also linked lists, this in use, but just to show how useful they are, we're going to start with an array list example that doesn't use generics. So we're going to create an array list populated with integers and a method that prints the contents of the array list doubled. So let's go through and write that code. It's a good idea to see that first before we actually go ahead and use generics. So I'm going to type array list items equals new array list. And we'll add some items. Items.add 1. Let's add another 4. So 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's actually adding an integer to the array list, and it's using auto boxing automatically, which we've done before in the course. It's converting the primitive type that we've typed in there into an integer. And what we're going to do then is call a method called print doubled. We're going to pass the parameter, which is our array list items. And that function we're going to write now, and its purpose is just to double the contents. So I'm going to type private static void print doubled, and it's going to be an array list n, and we'll put for object I n, and we're going to print integer, we're casting it as an integer I times 2. So just before we discuss that, we'll actually run it to make sure that it actually works. And you can see we've got the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we're actually doubling them, multiplying the current value by 2, so getting 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So that's actually worked. So we get the expected output. But note, however, we actually used object here because we didn't actually specify what the object was above, and we also had to cast it as an integer. So if I actually got rid of the cast here, we'd actually get an error. And the error was that it cannot be applied to objects. So we have to sort of tell Java what type of object is actually in that array list. So I'll put that back so that the code doesn't break. But technically, the array list, as we've created it, can actually contain anything, any type of object, not just an integer as we've actually done here. So that's actually more than a minor inconvenience because it also completely breaks the compiler's type checking. And just to see the impact of how this will affect us, if I try and add something here, like items.add, and add my name there. Now that's quite valid, and there's no indication that we've actually got a problem with our code. There's no red indications, red underlining our code. As far as Java is concerned, this is valid, and it actually is valid. But the problem is when we run it, we actually get an exception. So what's actually happening is with the object, which was a string, Tim in this case, trying to be converted to an integer, and it cannot be actually converted. You can see that java.lang.string cannot be cast to java.lang.integer. So in other words, we actually got an error because I tried to add a different type of data to the array list. The real problem wasn't so much that it crashed, although that's bad enough, but the real problem is that it's not actually showing up until runtime. So in other words, the program compiles fine. I can come up here and build and rebuild the project. And as far as Java is concerned, there are literally no problems. We've got a couple of warnings over here, potential warnings. Uncheck call to add E, it's a member of raw type array list, which is IntelliJ's way of sort of saying that maybe you should be doing this a different way. But the point is we don't actually get any errors as such. So if you actually see these errors in more detail, we can come up to the view menu, click Tools window, and actually select messages. So if we click on that, and we could do Command 0, and you can probably see what the equivalent keystroke is on your operating system. So click on that. You can see it's Alt 0 for Windows Linux, and we can actually see those warnings in more detail. We can actually see that main.java uses unchecked or unsafe operations, and that's Java's way of actually saying that there's actually a problem with our code. And again, just a confirmation that if we actually highlight this over here, IntelliJ is also sort of saying, okay, hang on, what are you doing here? So basically the Java compiler, and obviously IntelliJ by default, knows how to provide these warnings because they're actually looking at your code and they know that array list is a generic type, but we're using it without specifying a type parameter. In other words, using it without generics. So in other words, what we haven't done is sort of said with our array list what type of objects we're going to be storing in the array list. So the array list as we've used it here is a raw type. Now, prior to Java 1.5, this was the only way to code. There was no generics. And when Java 1.5 came out, they actually introduced the generics, which we're about to talk about. And they actually left this old way of doing things in purely for backwards compatibility with code that's written for previous versions. So, in other words, if they didn't do that, that old code would no longer run anymore. So the old code continues to run, but when you're writing new code, you should almost never use these raw types anymore. And you can see why, because obviously in this instance, we're able to crash it quite easily by making a simple little change there. And you might look at that and think, well, hang on, I know that there's integers and I'm never going to actually add a string there. But thinking ahead down the track, when your programs start getting a lot more complex, it can be a lot harder to track these types of bugs. This one's quite easy because it's only a few lines of code. It's certainly not recommended to use these raw types, and because type safety is so easy to implement these days in the current versions of Java, I highly recommend you actually do that. So when we actually provide a type parameter to a generic type, this is called a parameterized type. So we actually specify the type using angle brackets, and I know you've seen this before in earlier videos. So what we're going to do now is we're going to specify an integer type when we declare the array list on line 8, and also in the parameter on print double on line 20. So if we come up here to line 8, we're going to actually change this. We put our angle brackets in, integer. So we're actually saying now this is the type that we're actually going to be using in this array list. We're also going to come down here to line 19, I should say, and put array list integer, like so. So we're now specifying this is the type of data that we're actually going to be saving in our array list. And you can see what's happened straight away, that there's still a couple of errors. And you can see this one here is actually an error. It's actually telling us now that you're trying to add a string to what we've defined as an array list of integers, and it's actually an error. It's not a warning anymore, it's actually an error. So it's actually not allowing us to do that. But the first warning, it's still saying it's an unchecked assignment. We're actually still trying to use Java. It's actually saying now java.lang.integer, but it's still, as far as it's concerned, an unchecked assignment. And if I press my control function F1, and you can see it's just giving us an example of that. So we can actually fix that, try and fix that by putting another assignment here. We can actually type integer as well there. And that actually does get rid of that warning. So it does actually pay to look at these warnings that actually come up, and where appropriate to actually remove the code that is actually causing the warning. So you see in this case now, by adding an integer twice, we've actually removed the warnings, and I can actually now get rid of this as well, because that's no longer relevant. And we've now got a tick in the top right hand corner, and that basically says as far as IntelliJ is concerned, there's no longer any errors in our code, and our code is good to go. And again, if I get rid of that get rid of that parameterized type, we actually do get some warnings again. We get a few warnings, one here and also one here as well. So do actually pay heed to those errors, the warnings, because they do actually make sense to check them to make sure your code's adhering to the standards and you're not actually basically writing bad Java code. So adding a type here is actually unnecessary, because Java's got enough information in the declaration to the left-hand side to actually include that. So it's really is to see whether you're happy with these warnings or not. You could quite happily, as I showed you, delete that, and that is still valid and the code will still work. You've just got some warnings. So generally speaking, I would recommend just to do whatever it takes to get rid of the warnings, and you know that you're actually doing things the right way as far as the Java's concerned. And just also a note here, if you're actually doing this is another way of doing it. You can actually just specify the angle brackets without a type. And we've actually got an error message, and that's probably because I haven't set my appropriate language level up. So I'm just going to go into my settings, File, Project Structure. And I've got this set to 6 instead of 8. So I'm going to set that to 8. You notice Diamonds is set for version 7, but I'm going to set it to version 8 because that's what it should be for each project anyway. If I click OK to that, that error should actually go away. And so what that's saying there now, that's probably the best way of actually writing the code, because what that is saying is that the first declaration here on the left-hand side is all that it needs, and we don't actually have to type another one. And I think we'll actually get a warning now if we actually type this in here, because we actually set to 1.8. You can see we actually got a warning now. Explicit type argument can be replaced with the diamond, and that's what this is. The two, a less than and a greater than sign together, is referred to as a diamond. So that using the version 1.8, and again I did that with File, Project Structure. It's making sure project language level was set to 1.8. Because I've got that set to 1.8, we've actually got a tick across the board. So that's actually the correct way to actually use it to make sure you haven't got any warnings. But if you were using an older level of source code, as you saw I had 1.6 in use, then you will actually have to specify the actual parameter there. And again, using that without a parameter in the middle is called the diamond. So now we haven't got any errors and there's no warnings left. And I've actually removed this because, of course, before without removing that, we've actually got one error. And of course, the error again was trying to add a string to an integer object, to an array list of integers. So I'm going to comment that out to get rid of that error. So we've now got no warnings and no errors. We've got the green tick in the top right-hand corner, and that's exactly what we wanted. So by telling ArrayList what type of objects we wanted it to hold, the program now fails to compile when we try to add the value item Tim. So I have to comment that out in order for the code to even be able to work. Now, incidentally, coming down here looking at the loop, we can actually get rid of this cast now. We don't need that in there anymore. And we can change this. We can either set that to be an integer, or we can actually even go back and set that to an int. And Java is actually handling that for us automatically. Obviously, we don't need the object now because we know what type of data it actually is. And Java is smart enough to figure out that, okay, you're using an array list of integers here. Therefore, I know how to convert it back to an int. And it's doing that automatically with the auto boxing and unboxing that we've talked about in previous videos. And if we actually run this code, we should find that it actually works. And you can see we now get the same result. So that's the introduction to generics. In the next video, what I'm going to do is take it to the next level. We're going to actually look at creating our own generic classes. So I'll see you in that video.